Right, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You can see that the topic is continuous speech. Or if you want to put it another way, the most important thing about English for comprehensibility is rhythm. Rhythm, that is the alternation of heavy and light, strong and weak pressures in speaking. That's the most important set of signals that people listening to English get. They're the ones that make most effect on listeners. Listeners take more notice of these variations than they do of any other sort of thing. And when you think about it carefully, you can see why. For instance, there's a lot of emphasis on vowel and consonant quality. Naturally, in a course like this, will have to be dealt with, but it's not so important for comprehensibility. But we don't only aim at comprehensibility, but our first aim must be comprehensibility. Because if we can't be understood, if what we say can't be understood, then we're wasting our time on any other aspect of things. So, as I say, for understanding, English listeners, English speakers, listen for rhythm above all else. And if the rhythm goes wrong, then in some way, then it's less than normal for them and maybe below comprehensibility level. Now, I've got 2 lectures on this topic. We call them continuous speech. And the important thing about them is that practically all speech is continuous. Practically all speech does consist of more than one syllable. And so this is, in fact, in ordinary speech, normal speech. I'm talking about conversational English. Not making speeches, not reading out aloud, not delivering messages and so on. None of these formal special things, but ordinary exchanges between one individual person and another. So, now, my first point is made in the first paragraph. It points out to you that English speakers tend to give great weight to what they feel to be important syllables, and most of the time treat extremely neglectfully the less important syllables. That is a very important matter indeed, because it's what unites the various forms of English throughout the world. You know, there are hundreds of millions of English speakers around the world, and they don't all speak with the same accent. We have different accents in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, as well as the big areas where the large numbers are. America, of course, the United States, there's lots of variety there, and plenty of variety within the British Isles. And yet, an intelligent, educated person from any of those groups has no difficulty whatsoever in understanding 99.9% of what is said to him by speakers with the same language. So, why are they able to understand each other so easily when there are enormous differences, in fact? There are huge differences in the vowel system. The same vowel sound can actually stand for a different phoneme in different versions of English. If I say bet, right, unless you know what kind of accent I've got, you don't know what I'm saying. You don't know what word I'm using. If I happen to be an Australian, for instance, I would be saying the word B-A-T, which I personally pronounce bat, right? But bet is typical of an Australian way of saying that. Even 2 vowel phonemes are confused. And this is a common type of thing that there are big differences in the vowel systems around the world. So obviously there's something that's helping us get the message when there are these things that are different that would presumably, if they were very serious, spoil our getting the message. But they don't. And they don't because there's a huge agreement throughout the English-speaking world on how to treat words. Mostly the way words are treated have the same rhythmical patterns, and certainly when words are combined into sentences, the rhythmical patterns that people use are the same ones, almost entirely the same ones throughout the English-speaking world. So I'm not very worried when I'm teaching English as a foreign language about which accent my student adopts. I don't mind. Obviously it's convenient for me to teach and talk in terms of British English, but it doesn't really matter because it's the important thing, the things that they all have in common. So there's the point I've made in this first paragraph, that rhythm is the important thing. Now, this means that you've got to get the right pattern of stresses, weak and strong syllables that the native English speaker has if you are to be immediately, easily comprehensible by him. And of course there's a great deal of difficulty in doing that, because in fact, if you're a native speaker, some other languages have different patterns normally, then you're going to naturally obey the habits of that you've acquired in learning your own language. And the sort of thing that happens is that people typically, learning a foreign language, learning English as a foreign language, they learn the pronunciation of a word when they first meet it. And it's very hard for them to resist the conviction, a very false conviction, that that word will ever after be heard by them with exactly the same pronunciation as they first heard it. They tend to expect it to be the same. It won't be. Words in English change a good deal in their structure. They don't lose their rhythmic patterning usually, but they change in the contents of phonemes that they consist of. Lots of things are left out in continuous speech that are included when a word is said in isolation. What the present lecture is about is to explain which ways that happens. I've listed the ways that happens, and they are different importances, but I'll deal with each of them. Assimilation, under which you can include coalescence. Elision, probably the most important one. Compression, a minor one. And liaison. And we'll come to each of those in turn. So there we are then. And by the way, I said you can't expect a word to be as you first heard it, right? As it was first demonstrated to you by a teacher, perhaps. You also can't expect a word regularly to turn up in the form you find it in a dictionary. I hope you all use dictionaries to find out, to check on the pronunciations of words, because you know perfectly well that English spelling is so frequently very misleading about the pronunciation of the word. A native English speaker can't look at a word and think he knows how to say it. If it's a totally new word, the more complicated and longer it is, the less he's likely to be confidently saying it, as it usually is said by the people who use it. So, right then, we are looking at the forms words take other than their dictionary forms, citational or lexical forms. Only a tiny fraction of the commonly used reduced forms of words need be adopted as EFL targets. Now, there's the other side of the coin. You have to be aware that these words will change. You don't, fortunately, have to make all the changes that are made by the native English speaker. Fortunately, you can aim to say 99.9% of all the words you use in the form you find them in the dictionary, in the form they've been demonstrated to you, but not all. And unfortunately for you, although there are so very few that you really need to be aware of their changing values and make the changes that native English speakers do, if you want to sound normal, natural, ordinary in your speech, if you want to do that, then you've got to take account of only about 40 odd words, but they are the commonest words in the language. This is why they have got to take changing forms, because people use them so much they neglect them more than many other words. They are the function words, largely, the framework words of language, not the main issues. So there it is then. You don't need to bother with the variations that native English may make, although we shall deal with some of them now. But you must think about making the variations they make with these very, very common words, because they can make a big difference in meaning. This lecture really is only an introduction to my main lecture, the important one, and that's about weak form words. There's 4 dozen or so words that need that treatment. But anyway, just to look at what happens then. Section 4 deals with assimilation and points out that these changes can occur. They do smooth out the rhythm of the word for the speaker, but you don't have to worry about them, except in a few cases where you would sound a little bit artificial, particularly if you slow down a word to get the articulation you think it should have. So I'll give you examples there. But shelter, is she, and so on, and tortoiseshell, and horseshoe, and so on. If you say horseshoe and pause, that's a totally artificial pronunciation nobody uses who is a native speaker, so you're making a great mistake. You are disturbing the rhythm of the sentence, you're disturbing the pattern that he's expecting. So that won't be very good. But anyway, assimilation is not a very big problem. Neither is this coalescence, this subdivision of assimilation, where, and the example I've given here, Tuesday and due being pronounced as Tuesday and Jew, and did you pronounced as did you. You don't have to bother to adopt those forms, although you will constantly hear them. It's a good thing to know their existence, because then you will be able to not be thrown, not be puzzled by hearing. Right, so now are there any of those assimilations that you really must make? Otherwise you will sound too artificial, too foreign, too odd in your speech? Yes, perhaps one or two. Particularly the expression used to, right? There are two used to sequences in English. There's the common one, which means was accustomed to. I used to do this, right? And there's the other sequence that occurs occasionally. You could put them both in a sentence saying, feathers used to be used to right with. Used to was accustomed, used to employed for writing, used to write with. So, used to then you should get, and supposed to behaves in the same way. The other things that commonly happen in native speakers, you needn't worry about. You needn't bother to say, of course, instead of course. That's perfectly all right to say it either way. And also in section 7 there, I've pointed out to you some examples of past historical assimilation, where now there's only one ordinary way to say this word for most people, and it's not an ongoing one that people just accidentally employ in a sentence. It's the way they regularly say the word. So you might be a little surprised if you look in the dictionary under the words gooseberry, raspberry, fivepence, newspaper, that's given as the usual form of it. And of course, there's even a tendency amongst the native speaker to push the clock back and reform these words, to put them back as they were before. Because obviously, originally, fivepence was fivepence, or 5 pence. In fact, now, since 1971 we had decimal coinage, the word fivepence is not particularly often used. So you've got to forget that one really, but it is an example of what does happen. The same with newspaper. There's absolutely no objection to your saying newspaper, but in fact if you listen to native English speakers, they normally say newspaper, newspaper. Look at that sharp S there. So, on then to one or two really important things I have to say in the area of assimilation. Because what goes wrong for EFL learners in terms of assimilation, and not all of them, but it's quite a large number of them, it's people who speak Dutch, people who speak French, native speakers of Greek, and most of the Slavonic languages, and a lot of the African languages. People in that huge list of speakers have a strong tendency, inherited from their own language, to cause a consonant at the end of one word to be weakened, softened, when the next word begins with a softer consonant. So I've given examples by writing them out in a way that represents how the native speaker hears them, what he thinks he's hearing. He thinks he's hearing not the word back door, but bag door. He's not hearing baseball, but baseball. He's not hearing what he should hear, bus route, but buzz route. He's not hearing iceberg, but iceberg. He's not hearing watchman, but wadgeman. He's not hearing a wristwatch, but wristwatch. He's not hearing a rope ladder, but robe ladder. And he's not hearing roast beef, but rose beef. All of which sound very strange expressions, right? So you should certainly, if you have that sort of tendency, avoid it. So if you have that tendency, if you identify one of those languages, be careful of that sort of word. And a very much smaller group, but it is particularly important for Dutch speakers, they do the reverse thing. They tend to turn words like dreadful, fog patches, and flagpoles into dreadful, fog patches and flagpoles, which of course sound very strange to native English speakers. At least they sound very strange all over the English-speaking world except one very small area, where there are only a few million people living, and that's Yorkshire. In Yorkshire they do tend to do this. And people who live, most of the people who live in the city of Bradford, don't call it Bradford, they call it Bradford. Bradford. And they have a T or a glottal stop before the F in Bradford. instead of Bradford, which is what the rest of the English-speaking world and the educated people in Yorkshire call it. Right. So, there we are then, assimilation. Now, the next thing I'm going to deal with is the most important of the whole setup. This is elision. Elision is a special word used in linguistics for what we would call in ordinary terminology, omission, leaving something out. And remember what is happening. The reason these are left out is the speaker feels that the syllable that he makes the elision of is not very important. What's happening is when a speaker uses language, he arranges the words in a way that's appropriate grammatically. So it's all part of his message. You're not getting the message across clearly if you don't make the kind of adjustment that's needed to smooth out certain parts of what we're saying and give emphasis to others. That is another way of putting it, get the right rhythm. If you've got the right rhythm, then you will tend automatically to lose certain items that you haven't got time to make because you want to get over them, past them, to the more important items that you're interested in saying. So here we are then. Elision is omission. Now, there are lots of elisions that you would naturally, automatically make without realizing it, perhaps. And certainly, it's difficult not to make elisions when you use expressions like in my second line there, breaststroke, first stop, masked ball, next time, and so on. But what you've got to guard against is failing to make the elision there. Because if you try to say breaststroke or next time, you won't sound like a person having an ordinary conversation at all. So there's the warning there. These are perfectly natural elisions. You want to note which ones English speakers make, and they usually are the result of simplifying a heavy group of consonants. Right. So, some more examples then. I've shown you again not official spellings, not normal spellings, but spellings which indicate what the person might think they're hearing. Now this is okay. These particular elisions don't matter, if you like. Good eel instead of good deal. Take care instead of take care. Prime Minister instead of Prime Minister. Occasionally, native English speakers notice other speakers making these elisions, so they will often complain. People will write into the newspapers to claim that the language is going to the dogs and people are no longer speaking properly as they were taught to in their school, right? But don't take much notice of that sort of thing. What I do find is anybody who was an expert in linguistics, anybody who was a leading figure in the world of pronunciation and so on, anybody like Professor Wells or any other person as well equipped as him would never write in about such things to complain about the way people pronounce. What they ought to do is, of course, observe what people do, and then you get to know what's normal. So there they are then. Take care becomes take care, Prime Minister becomes Prime Minister normally, and that's one that's often I've seen grumbled at in newspapers. And extra attention comes with it to sound it's no different, extra attention. There we go. Now, other things that people smooth out very much. You don't absolutely have to try and say anything other than 6:30, which is, I expect, what you want to say, because you want to pronounce each of those three words as you learn to say them, 6:30. But in fact, most people say 6:30, or even the thing the transcription I got at the end of the paragraph, 6:30, 6:30. Even sometimes reducing the middle syllable to short, 6:30. Perhaps dropping the H. Anyway, there you are. Those kinds of simplifications occur quite often. Now, I've drawn particular attention to the Latin-derived adverbs. And a lot of those were originally learned words, really. Somehow they got into general use. And because I'm sure in Shakespeare's time, people didn't use words like actually and obviously. But here we are then, they're now very common. Actually. Now, actually is never pronounced that way in ordinary conversation by anybody today. but all the dictionaries seem to suggest that it is, if you don't read them very carefully. And some, even if you do read them carefully, they are saying you should pronounce it actually, but people don't. That was 4 syllables, actually, right? That was 4 syllables. Nobody pronounced it 4 syllables these days, right? Many pronounce it 3, quite a lot pronounce it only 2. So when they reduce it, they say actually, or actually. In other words, there could be a schwa for the middle bit that looks as if it's a diphthong in the dictionary, right? Actually, it's a schwa in the middle. And very often people don't even have that schwa. They say actually. Don't even have the T, actually. So these get generally reduced. Generally, you notice, not generally. Generally sounds very old-fashioned and fussy to me. They did exist, no doubt, in the century before last, in Victorian times, but nobody says generally now. They generally say generally, or generally. And another word that's a favourite with many people these days, none of the dictionaries are willing to record the fact that it's no longer pronounced obviously with 4 syllables, but obviously. In fact, that goes through huge numbers of reductions with very large numbers of people. So keep that one to 3 syllables, obviously. Usually is another one. Usually, like actually, is not usually in 4 syllables, but it's usually either 2, as I just said it in, usually, or if it's 3, it's usually, and with a schwa in the middle. So those all will make your speech sound a little bit slow and artificial if you use the so-called dictionary forms of them. My last example in this little set is the word well, let me say it as I heard it once about 10 years ago from an announcer on the BBC who has now retired. He was a very clever actor, very conscious of his speech, had ideas on how he should say things. I may say not got from lectures on phonetics, but from his own opinions, if you like. But he tried to say, and did succeed in saying, temporarily. Oh, good heavens, nobody says it that way now. In fact, most people, they either say temporarily, that's very common now, very popular now, but it means you do say all the syllables that are there, but you ease the matter by moving the stress later. But most people, many people still say temporarily as 3 syllables. And then it comes out exactly the same as the word temporarily from temporal. And temporal means to do with ordinary everyday matters as opposed to religious, spiritual matters, right? On we go then to section 12, and here is a little warning. When you are trying to say things like postman, windmill, or grandfather, you'll find that people do drop a consonant in these things very commonly. You mustn't try avoiding dropping that consonant. In other words, you mustn't say take care or postman, because you create an impression of quite a different word from what you want. You add syllables in that are not normally there. So postman, woman, and grandfather must not be pronounced as take care, postman, with the mill, or grandfather, but postman, with your grandfather, and so on. Another little warning in 13, there are lots of pitfalls for you in our spelling. In our spelling we have words like blackguard, can you see them here? Calm, Christmas, cupboard, evening, not evening. Right? Nobody says good evening, right? Good evening, it's been 2 syllables only for about 500 years now, right? So, good evening. Soften, again. Actually, with the word soften, I've hardly ever heard anybody put the T in. The odd, eccentric person now and again, if you like, but once or twice ever in my life. But the word often, right, which behaved in the same way. In the 19th century, by the beginning of the 20th century, people were such a common word, and people were so familiar with the spelling that they couldn't resist the tendency, many of them, to put the T back in. Well, it's often pronounced often, of course, but it's still often pronounced often. So you have a choice there, if you want. And I think the predominant one is still often with no T, like soften. But on no account put a T into soften, right? Don't say soften, say soften. So there it is then. And now, in the last in section 13, the affixes ch and j. You might think about those, that they're such heavy things to pronounce, that people would simplify them and take the route they usually do in it. This is a curious sort of thing out of line with the general pattern of what we're discussing. We're talking about the way English speakers lose sounds and simplify sounds, but apparently we all resist simplifying a sequence of two ch sounds or two j sounds. Now look at the wrong spelling now he was trying at the end of the paragraph. You don't have village church, you don't have H.G. Wells, you don't have what chain, you have village church. H.G. Wells and watch chain. We say both of them. This is the other side of the coin. Don't attempt an oversimplification there. Right. And finally, on elision, which you see is my longest item. Finally, on elision, there's this matter of some words that you probably noticed there's a little bit of a natural overlap between what I'm saying now and what Professor Wells was saying. I think he mentioned compression. Naturally, these things do come up in various contexts. And he mentioned things like fifths, sixths, and twelfths, for instance. And I've given an important example here, a very common word, the word month. The plural of month is spoken by most people, not as months. Now, if you can manage to say months, you may excite the admiration of some people. Most of us don't say months, we say months, and leave the th out, it's easier. But for heaven's sake, don't say 2 months. For 2 months sounds completely wrong. You've got to have an S there. You need to have the th. And something similar happens with fifths and sixths and twelfths. 5, 6, for instance, the th drops out altogether and you have a long S. Oh, now, some people are so anxious not to do that, which they consider improper, wrong, because they're not listening carefully, they're not taking proper account of what people really do say. They want to keep the th, and then they find they can't say it all, so they lose the final S, and they say 5, 6. Because that now has become so common, like putting the T back into often, for instance, that you can't say it wrong now. There's so many people do it, and it's become one of the alternatives. But it was started as a bit of purism on the part of the people who wanted to do it, but it's won the day now. Once you have very large numbers of people doing the thing, you have to accept it, whether you like it or not. So, twelfths too, similarly, but the other thing I want to mention before I finish that paragraph is this, that a lot of particularly longer words that end in STS, people are so anxious not to leave the T out. For instance, the plural of scientist used to be scientists with a long S, right? Losing the T. And then a lot of people want to make sure they have the right pronunciation and they try and keep the T. So they do keep the T. And they say, a gathering of scientists. In other words, they can't manage to say the STS in succession, and they drop out the last sound. They drop out the signal of the plural. It doesn't matter, they do it. So and it's done now on such a large scale, you can't possibly call it abnormal. On the other hand, dictionary writers are very reluctant to admit these things. Professor Wells, for instance, doesn't admit the plural of scientists as scientists. But maybe he will in due course, you know, I mean, after a while, one gives in about these things. In between his 2 editions of the dictionary, for instance, in the first one he regarded old, instead of old, as non-RP, as he called it, right? But by the time he did the second edition, he decided old was RP. In other words, was a general pronunciation that was acceptable to most people. So, things change over the years. Right, now finally I've got 2 minor items. Compression and elision. I always like dealing with compression because I can make my boast that I was the one who invented the term. I introduced the term into the literature in my book in 1969 called A Guide to English Pronunciation, and I'm happy to see that Professor Wells has taken the term up and uses it extensively now, particularly in his dictionary. So, what is then compression? Well, it's losing a syllable or losing a sound by changing something from a vowel into a semivowel, into a W, an E into a Y, and so on. So you've got the word radio, for instance, which has 3 syllables when you say it by itself, usually. But when I say Radio Times, I've only got it 2 syllables. And again with following, right? If I say the word following in isolation, firmly and clearly, I've certainly got 3 syllables. But when I talk about the following paragraph, I've dropped out that middle syllable and gone straight from the all the way down. Now, luckily for you, you don't have to do this. If you say following, and you say it rapidly like that, without slowing down artificially for it, then you're okay. And now, there is the odd little warning here. I've said about, although you can forget about making these reductions for the most part, there are certain sets of words I'd recommend you to try and make these compressions with. And they are words like fire and power, where you've got a diphthong for plus a schwa, I plus schwa or R plus schwa. And so the fireman and powerful sound to me over emphatic, old-fashioned, awkward expressions. It's much better to say fireman and powerful. Now, what one is saying when it says fireman is probably some sort of diphthong. You're losing the it element, and it's powerful, you're going from R to from the R vowel to a schwa without that vowel in between, and that's the normal way to say it. Of course, if you say the words on their own, it's okay to make fire 2 syllables, it's okay to make power 2 syllables, although many people do make the smoothing out into when they're a single word say by themselves, and say fire and power, and so on, but you don't have to do that. And if you fail to, you can sound very odd. I mean, words like empire, empire sounds odd to me, and so does rush hour, which we normally pronounce rush hour. Right? Rush hour sounds terribly heavily. Hour doesn't sound a clumsy, but rush hour does. Too much clarity, if you like, in that second syllable. Other things where you get these compressions, fattening becomes fattening, settler becomes settler, 2 syllables. Thank you. Civilization becomes civilization. Not very important for you to worry about those. Anyway, I've shown you there how Professor Wells shows these things. The little loop, the little compression loop in his dictionary, and he has a very good paragraph on the whole phenomenon. Right, finally then, there's this term we borrow from French. It's the French word liaison, but we of course pronounce it liaison or something like that. Liaison is joining up where there has traditionally always been an R at the end of the word spelled ending in the letter R or ending in the spelling RE. We regularly keep that R, which we threw away in other situations 2.5 centuries ago, right? By the end of the 18th century, people weren't saying the R at the end of the word butter or better. They dropped it, but not in an expression like better and better. They kept on saying it, and they still do. So we have these various expressions, like in this last paragraph here. Our own, or else, better and better, later on, far off, other end, pair of. All those expressions, if you leave the R out, will sound very odd, artificial, unusual, because native speakers just don't do that. They keep it in. And to say something, we are on our own, for instance, sounds very odd English indeed. We are on our own. But I wouldn't incorporate that pattern into your own speech. You use those linking R's. Also, you don't need to, this is where a vowel follows the next word and a previous word ends in R. But if there are some cases similar to these where people like to put these R's in that were never there 300 years ago. And so you get things like the idea. Now that is perfectly normal today. Most people do that. We find it a smoother transition, the transition we're accustomed to make at the end of one word and vowel at the beginning of the next. So idea of it is completely normal English. And you're quite clever if you can say idea of it and not sound a bit odd. Because there are some people, you see, there are these precious people, these purists, who want to tell us, the rest of us, how to behave linguistically. Right? And they say, oh, but there's no R in the spelling, so you mustn't say it. And so some people have condemned pronunciation like the idea of it. Right? But it is absolutely normal. It's the way we ordinarily speak. So I recommend you to adopt it, or at least not to avoid saying it. So I've given a couple more examples. That in the last paragraph. people say, I saw it, for instance, and they even put an R in the middle of a word like drawing. Even BBC radio news readers can be heard say drawing, drawing. Now there's no R in the spelling, there never was one in the past, but on analogy with other words, they put an R in there, and it's a habit of having an R between or at the end of one word and the next word beginning with a vowel. Now here they transfer that pattern into the inside of a word, if you like, not between two words. So it's a little irregular, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend you to adopt it because it certainly isn't approved by the majority of people today. So I'd stick with drawing if I were you, and I saw it if you can, right? But I saw it is completely commonplace, so if you want to adopt that, then you needn't be afraid to. And amongst the jokes people make, making fun of the people who do this, is this book title. You know, English speakers are very fond of silly book titles, right? Where there's a pun on the title of the author and the title of the book. And here we are then, Dog's Delight by Nora Bow. Right? It sounds like a woman author's name, but of course it is, in fact, it's Nor, that's what a dog does, Nora Bow. And given this expression, law and order. Margaret Thatcher always talked about law and order, which is perfectly normal. But law and order, and of course people pretended they misunderstood this as a woman's name. Right? Laura, her first name, and Norda, the second. Well, there you are.